Hey everybody, welcome back to another Q&A on April 11th, 2023. So I've got all my questions in front of me. We'll go ahead and dive into those. So there was a couple people that asked like 8 questions. I did not get all of them copied over, but 1 or 2 from each. So could moving down to TRT and resulting increase in estrogen cause a couple pounds of fluid retention acutely? I assume what they probably mean is a change in the ratio of androgens to estrogens. If the testosterone level drops, then amount of estrogen is going to drop because there'll be less aromatization, or there'll be less there to aromatize. However, if there were other compounds in the mix that were not aromatizing, then that ratio of androgens to estrogens may change. So to answer the question, assuming that's what you mean, then the answer could be, yeah, potentially. And I notice that some people will have some issues transitioning because you got to remember that androgen level and estrogen level may not fall at the same rate simply because the hormones aren't metabolized at the same speed. So, you may be here to begin with, and then androgens fall and estrogen maybe takes a little bit longer to fall, perhaps. So it's definitely possible, like people notice some issues in that transition period. Best tips on reverse dieting and how long that process should be. Well, that's a super broad question. I would actually just go listen to the podcast on that. So OPD podcast, and you can go to the link tree in my bio. We did one on post show. I would just listen to that because that's going to go over everything reverse dieting related. So that's what I would go check out. That's would be like a 30 or 45 minute video in and of itself, probably. Best practices to build up to high food with minimal fat gain. Again, kind of a broad question, but I can give some general insight on that. One is that high food is of course going to be relevant to the person, context dependent. Just because I eat this much or he eats this much or she eats this much doesn't mean that you will. However, one thing to keep an eye on is just the quality of the weight that you are gaining. So looking at actual muscle to fat gain ratio. If you gain 5 pounds and it looks like you gain 4 pounds of fat, that's not a very favorable ratio. Pacing yourself at a certain rate of gain is going to probably minimize that to an extent. You may gain a little bit quicker out of the gate coming out of a deficit or something like that because glycogen and intramuscular triglycerides and all these things are refilling fluid, right? But beyond that point, rate of gain is probably going to be pretty slow. If you're gaining a pound a week deep into the gaining phase, you're probably going to get fat quick. So just keep that in mind. Monitoring biofeedback in terms of insulin sensitivity could be helpful to make sure that you're partitioning favorably. Digestion, making sure that you're eating foods and using macro splits that are digestive friendly for you. Not creating unnecessary systemic inflammation. And probably those 3 things, rate of gain, insulin sensitivity, food selection, are going to be probably your biggest parameters in this case. Optimal butt plug size for best gains. You want one that is just applies a little bit of pressure, but you kind of have to brace into it. You don't want one that's just blowing it out because then you don't have any, anal bracing. So make sure that you have just big enough that it's tight, but you can still brace into it. That's key. How to overcome binge eating so it doesn't interfere with my bodybuilding goals anymore. That's a big topic. I'm not going to sit here and tell someone how to overcome their binge eating because, again, it could be so many things that could contribute with that. However, here's what I'll say. Having worked with this plenty of times, you really need to examine the source of the binge eating first. A lot of people are looking for, when it comes to disordered eating and any type of disordered behavior, deleterious behavior, is you're looking for something to fix it, and really it lies in why is it occurring to begin with. Look back in your bodybuilding journey and figure out when that started to occur. If it was already there before you started, then you probably shouldn't have started. Chat for a different time, but look back and figure out what took place leading up to that habit forming, and your answer probably lies there. Now, also using binge and restrict is always going to make this more difficult. Looking at hunger signaling being abnormal, these are psychological hunger cues. People that are already full physically, but they just keep eating. So figure out why that is. Have you been chronically lean? Do you have imbalances chemically? This is not always just a willpower thing. There's certainly, chemical or neurochemical imbalance that goes into this: dopamine, serotonin, leptin levels, like all of these things. So if you're not spending enough time at steady rates of caloric surplus or maintenance, then and trying to compensate your binging by restricting, then you're going to have continued signaling, right? The body's all about homeostasis. So signaling is going to be dictated by what your body wants to do body composition wise. That's why you get those weird cravings and weird things that go on when you get very lean or put in post show, right? So you have to look into those areas a bit more. That would just be some general advice right now. That's a pretty complex topic. Thoughts on deadlifts for upper back development? Yeah, you could. So, I mean, deadlifts, a lot of the tension in the back is more static, right? It's isometric. It's not really, you're hip hinging. So more of the concentric movement is not really in the back. I mean, the back, like the scapulas will probably rotate a little bit, right? Which will maybe contract the musculature in the upper back, but for the most part, it's a pretty static and isometric hold. There's a lot of tension, but it's not necessarily moving through a range of motion. It's mostly isometric. So it will, I mean, it's definitely going to develop that area to an extent, right? I mean, we've seen that plenty of times, and anatomically it makes difference, or it makes sense that it would. So yes. Now, is that what I would probably do if you're purely lacking upper back and that's what you want to develop? Probably not, because the reason is going to be that if you're lacking development in that area, then you're probably, already more developed in another area down that posterior chain, either glutes, hamstrings, erectors, whatever it is, and those areas are most likely going to take the brunt of that movement anyhow. The tension in a compound multi-joint movement like that is going to be directed towards that strongest area. So if you are kind of really mismatched, then of course, you're not going to really get as much upper back work in that movement as you are somewhere down the posterior chain. So just keep that in mind. Best practices for fatigue management. Again, pretty broad question, but take a quick stab at it. I mean, why are you fatigued? Backtrack, figure out what is causing fatigue. So fatigue is going to be more of generally an accumulation of allostatic load, right? All of these stressors filling that bucket, and that bucket's overflowing. And then also, what can you manage most easily? Is your schedule super busy with work, career, family, whatever? So you have to allocate a lot of resources towards that, and that's kind of a non-negotiable. Do you have room for improvement in terms of stress control in those areas? Just because you're busy doesn't mean you can't still manage perception to stress in those areas. And then figure out what's the easiest things I can start pulling from. Sometimes it's training volume for people. They just need to train an amount that is going to match up with everything else, right? In that total allostatic load. Maybe it's sleep. Maybe your sleep sucks, right? Could be that. Maybe you're very inconsistent with sleep and wake times. Maybe the quality of the sleep is bad. I mean, it could be so many things. Maybe you're taking in a pre-workout late in the day and your sleep quality is poor because of that, and that's accumulating over time. I mean, it could be so many things. Maybe it's something more chronic in terms of, adrenal insufficiency. So you're really dealing with a lot of downregulation, chronic fatigue, hormone imbalances. I mean, it could be so many things. So without investigating those areas, I'm just giving you areas that you can investigate, but without me having any of that, it would be pretty much impossible to give any actual suggestions. But hopefully that gives you an idea of things you can look at. All right, that is it for this time around. I hope everyone enjoyed the Q&A. Thank you for submitting your questions, and we'll talk to you next time.